worked under the guidance and approval of Chief and Council of the South Nation, and who also approved my dissertation and have approved me to develop it into a book. So enough of that. Now let's get going so everybody can get to coffee. Where the heck? How come this? Okay. There. Okay. So my research examines Indigenous relationships with plants and ecosystems, resource stewardship and land governance, Indigenous legal orders or Indigenous law, and customary legal landscapes, largely associated with Coast Salish women's plant practices. And oh, come on. It's a technology thing. And the research question of my dissertation, and continues on because it's so big, is in Canada, how are Indigenous peoples' relationships with culturally significant plant species and expansion and expression of Aboriginal rights? And so that's under our Constitution. Aboriginal rights are protected. The supreme law in Canada, the Constitution, they're protected, and so also known as Indigenous right. And I also ask how these rights can be affirmed and exercised using a form of intersocietal law, Indigenous law and Canadian law, woven, sometimes working completely separately, sometimes together, within and between First Nations and state governments. Be good. And I use three organizing concepts of analysis. One is a canon of plant knowledge mixed with covenants of reciprocity, which we talked about a lot the other night, agreements between people and plants, as well as customary landscapes. And so canon of plant knowledge is something that is my conception. So if you think about Pickard Burke's and Nancy Turner's definitions of traditional ecological knowledge, a canon of plant knowledge is within that. So it's incremental learning over centuries, empirical observations, experimentation and hypothesizing. And it's all of the botanical and other knowledge related to plants developed and exercised by Sauk throughout their territories for centuries. And I use this concept because in Sauk, as well as in many other Canadian Indigenous communities, plant use and knowledge has been disrupted hugely by their by dispossession of lands, residential schools, just the horrible history of colonialism. And so I wondered, well, if this knowledge is there, because it's written and it's documented in texts and recorded, etc., it has to sort of, it almost exists outside of time. And so like you can have a canon of Italian lute music, you have a canon of this related works of plant knowledge, of plant knowledge, which is completely and totally theirs, their intellectual property, and is never lost. Covenants of reciprocity, talks about humans forming relationships with favored plant species, as Robin Wall-Kimmerer says, and these covenants or agreements regulate these human-plant relationships in a manner that it once promotes and manages abundance of culturally important plants and plant products within ecosystems, and this is very key to my research, that are highly variable. And so in that, I just want to really emphasize that ethnobotanists study relationships between people and plants, people and animals, etc. Law is all about relationships. Law is relationships. And so that is why this is a really lovely fit and significant. Thank you. And a customary landscape, I looked deeply at different definitions of landscape, and I finally found Kenneth Alwig, who's an American geographer, but he teaches in Sweden, and he talks about this as being an assemblage of land governed by the laws of an assembly. He researched deeply into what landscape originally meant, the original meaning of the word all across Northern Europe and in Britain. And this is that meaning. It's not about a collection of, gardens and a scenic sort of landscape. But it's defined as an expression of a relationship between a collection of people, lands, and species through customs, practices, and laws that are regulated by their community polity and so often in a moot or a port. So I loved that, because if you just go forward again, because it really sort of highlights something else. It's another theme throughout my research, which is how the Western notion of property and property in law has completely disrupted ecological relationships, and it's very significant. The enclosure movement that happened, over 300 years in Britain and the rest of Europe, which alienated from the people, transformed their lands and resources and access to resources into capital, and is a deeply ecological story, which changed the relationship, disrupted that relationship between people and place, and it continues to do so. And it also hugely affects the way that we deal with plants and land in law, because land is only viewed as the highest and best use of land is fee simple property, and that is only important when it's improved in through field cultivation, primarily by its own. This is my case study it's on southwestern BC, southwestern Vancouver Island, Sauk Territory. You can get a little picture of it there. And then the Sauk people are part of the Coast Salish world, but they also have a subset within that world of Strait Salish people that gather in the green area you see around the southern straits. And they share a language, as well as reef netting complex, camas cultivation, and a whole bunch of other cool things. This is a map of the Sauk Nation territory, which 2023, that expresses the tenures that have been imposed by state governments in the Sauk territory. So all that blue area is private lands, privately owned lands. The pink salmon covered area is another enclosed area. It's the watershed area that services all the water for southern Vancouver Island. The green areas are park reserves. The hatched area is a timber license area. The brown areas are federal areas, and there's two tiny, around Soup Basin at the bottom, there's two little fuchsia, those areas, those are the self-reserves, 167 acres, some of the smallest in Canada. So you can see of their traditional territory, they have very limited jurisdiction over a very small area. So I looked at how do Sauk peoples work in collaboration with culturally important plant species and variable ecosystems, and the key points that I took away from this are, is the mutuality of relationships between people and plants. Women's extensive roles in plant management. Oh my gosh, that went by fast. That's not fair. It wasn't up that fast. Variability of plant abundance over seasons and ecosystems, intensive and extensive use of plants, and stewardship of ecosystems. And what I really want to emphasize here is in ethnobotany, we tend to look at the seasonality of plant use as being really, super important. And it absolutely is super important. I really pushed how ecosystem, the management and use of ecosystems is more important, or equally is important. And I take from Wayne Suttles, who's the granddaddy of Coast Salish ethnography. I build on what he said in that way. And so carrying on, and I also look at the intensive and extensive use of plants in the sense that we tend to focus right now a lot, and this is a lot of it's because of legal cases, on cultivation. These small bounded areas of camas cultivation as being super, super important, in the most important thing in plant use. But I say no. I think the extensive uses are equally as important for various reasons. And so of course, I have these long tables in the back of standard ethnobotanies of 100 different species. And I say it's all the species are important, not just the top 10 so-called culturally keystone species. They were all important for various reasons. And then what I was able to do was I mapped them using terrestrial ecosystem mapping, which is a provincial system there where we have very good mapping of ecosystems defined as by their soil structure, their geomorphology, their aspect, and their plant communities. So I was able to identify where culturally important species were in this large colored sample area and show the variability of ecosystems. And the point I was able to make very strongly is that people couldn't just walk out the back of a big house and collect all 100 plants. You had to have a very deep ecological knowledge of soil and aspect and plant communities in order to find what you needed when you needed it, as well as a very enhanced and deep understanding of forest succession. Okay. And mapping, I also had, there was this idea of predictive, there's a very predictive quality to this mapping. I was able to show that camas isn't actually found in a large part of this territory because of, and so, which emphasizes their need for burning, carrying on. And then berries are everywhere, but highly prized species are not. And the cedar, oh, I love the cedar part the best, but we're going to skip that because it takes a lot to explain. Anyways, I was able to show that using ethnobotany and ethnoecological scholarship, if you skip to the next one, we, I emphasized that there was a massive social and physical infrastructure that supported all of this plant use. And that without that very complex structure, you couldn't manage these ecosystems in this way. And carrying on. And so I created a counter map of the 10-year map that I showed you, which showed all of these important relationships between species, between people, between the physical infrastructure through trails and nets and smokehouses throughout the territory. And then I found that plant use, which I knew at the beginning, is a very recognized area of Canadian law. But I think I also made the point, ethnobotany and ethnoecology can definitely be used to support Aboriginal rights litigation as defined in Canadian law. It's very quantitative and it's wonderful in that sense. And it has that potential to be very supportive in that way. But as we go on, it only captures a slice of all of that map that I showed you, all of those important human-plant relationships through territory. And Aboriginal law in particular is strangely silent when it comes to deliberating on Indigenous rights to plants and, more importantly, management of the ecosystems and customary landscapes within which these plants reside. Again, this all goes back to our conception of what the best use of property is, or the best definition of property is, and what constraints can be put on private property owners. So carrying on, I also, my conclusions were that South Nation has a very obvious and long-standing management of plant species in various ecosystems, which supports a very significant claim of legal rights and research is broadly applicable to other First Nations in BC. And in order to properly understand and accommodate these rights, I have a whole chapter on making much more legal space to researching Indigenous laws, which will then help us expand the Canadian legal system to just looking at, well, you have a right to practice gathering berries in this little spot, to really reflecting this millennial stewardship of these territories and these interactions, relationships. And and so there's super wonderful, great potential to build a co-governance. I hope to spend the rest of my career looking at building co-governance or co-management models that include Indigenous management of lands, animals, plants, and ecosystems in a way that acknowledges and reinforces plurality and the multi-juridical nature of Canada's legal system. And you can come and ask me what multi-juridical means. And that is South territory. We just went up there the other day. Yeah, I'd love to. I don't need coffee. You can keep Gaia out there. Skyland.
So, wow, like fantastic work. I'm so really excited that you're doing this. I'm wondering too if it if your work kind of partners too with that. Simon in the chat.
Yeah, well, one of the things I don't think I emphasized here, I dragged that all across the country. I was going to wear it, But yes, cultural keystone species are important, but one of the things I find and I say is that in law, we tend to focus on places and sites. And I worked in heritage management for a long time. So everybody is like, you have to identify a site in order to protect it. And that's, again, that's all smacks back to property. And I say, you know, Indigenous people had relationships with a certain number of plant species and also ecosystems and managing those ecosystems. And that's very, you know, yes, there are sites and those should be protected. That's important, culturally important places, but it goes much beyond that. It's very easy to say, okay, we'll protect this little site, Thunderbird's, well, Thunderbird's nest is very important site, but you know, we'll protect this archaeological site, which may or may not have importance to the community today. And I think that's where the Canadian law is very prescriptive and is very unimaginative and yeah, it's also very hugely colonial. And that is when people complain about Canadian law, probably American law, as being something that you can't fix the problem by using within that system. That's problematic. Yeah. So I just think it has to go way beyond that. Yes, Abe.
Do you feel like there are examples of successful jurisdictional governance that could be referenced in navigating this, in my mind, new terrain?
I think there is potential, not yet in terms of plans, but I also, because of the Indigenous law movement in Canada, and there's Indigenous law programs in Quebec. Quebec has for a very long time taught something called trans-systemic law. So in Canada, there's common law and the civil law that work together. So Quebec law and the rest of Canadian law. And so that's called a bijuridical. There's two types of law systems and they're taught in Quebec. They're taught side by side. And so some countries you have one law system and that's how you go, but there's lots of examples throughout the world where two legal systems can coexist and inform each other to make decisions. And of course, because we have the protection of Aboriginal rights that is protected by the Canadian Constitution, there's more. There's a plurality of laws in principle. It's just that, of course, Aboriginal law has been ignored. Yeah, for 200 years.
Sorry.